What if the woman all of London laughed at turned out to be the only one who could see the truth? When Duke Julian Ravenshaw married the quiet daughter of a poor scholar, society called it the greatest mistake of his life. In drawing rooms and glittering ballrooms, nobles whispered that the Duke had chosen the wrong bride. A woman too plain, too unknown, and far beneath his rank. But while London mocked the new Duchess, something far more dangerous was unfolding behind the grand walls of Ravenshaw Manor. Secrets were being hidden, fortunes were quietly disappearing, and the Duke himself was closer to ruin than anyone realized. The only person who began to see the pattern was the very woman everyone had underestimated. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. The south garden of Ravenshaw Manor had been dressed for celebration with a kind of ruthless perfection that only old money could achieve. White chairs marched in neat rows beneath ancient oaks, their branches laced with pale ribbons that fluttered when the wind moved through the leaves. The gravel path, freshly raked until it looked like sugar, ran straight as a blade toward the small altar where a clergyman waited with a prayer book held like a judgment. Crystal bowls of roses sat at intervals, their scent sweet enough to be almost cloying in the cool air. London had talked about this wedding for weeks, not because it promised romance, because it promised entertainment. The guests arrived in waves of satin and black coats, a tide of titled faces and polished smiles. They took their seats with an air of solemn anticipation that did not quite belong to holy matrimony. It was the anticipation of people who had come to witness a spectacle, something uncommon enough to become a story told at every tea table and club for the rest of the season. A woman in dove-gray silk leaned toward her companion, hiding her mouth behind a feathered fan. Ravenshaw could have married anyone in London, she murmured, and he chose the daughter of a poor scholar. Her friend's lips curved in a thin smile. Perhaps the Duke has grown tired of better options. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through their row, spreading like perfume. At the beginning of the path, Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stood beside her father, Sir Malcolm Whitcomb, under the shadow of an arch entwined with ivy. The borrowed veil at her hairline felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not only lace, but expectation, an expectation she had never been allowed to meet. Her gown was ivory, but not the kind of ivory that announced itself with extravagant beading or yards of imported lace. It was simple, fine fabric, cut well, the sort of dress chosen by a woman who did not expect to be examined for flaws. Sir Malcolm watched the guests with a professor's calm, but his hand resting on Eleanor's arm betrayed him. It tightened and loosened, as if he could not decide whether to protect her or let her go. "You still have time to withdraw, Eleanor," he said softly. Eleanor shook her head, the movement small enough that only he would notice. "No, father," she answered. Her voice did not waver. "Duke Ravenshaw has made his choice, and so have I." Her father exhaled a quiet surrender. "Then walk with your chin lifted. If they stare, let them." Eleanor's gaze traveled down the path to where the groom stood waiting. Duke Julian Ravenshaw was unmistakable even at a distance. Tall, composed, dressed in black formal attire that fitted him like armor. His dark hair was kept neat, his posture straight without arrogance. The expression on his face was restrained, neither warm nor cold, simply controlled, as though the gossip surrounding this marriage had never existed. He looked like a man who had learned long ago not to offer the world anything it could grasp. The quartet began to play. The first notes carried across the garden like breath held and released. Eleanor felt her father's arm steady beneath her fingers, and then she stepped onto the gravel path. The moment she moved, the whispering rose again, soft and insistent, as natural as wind in trees. A young gentleman leaned close to his friend. "I thought Ravenshaw would marry Lady Vivian Ashcroft." His friend gave a knowing look. All of London did. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lady Vivian Ashcroft appeared at the edge of the garden. She did not enter quietly. She swept in with the confidence of a woman accustomed to being looked at and more dangerously accustomed to being believed. Her gown was a deep blood-like red that seemed almost indecent amid the pale pastels of the guests. It clung in the wrong places and gleamed in the sunlight as if it had been cut with deliberate provocation. Her golden hair was arranged in glossy curls, and her lips carried a smile too sharp for joy. A woman near the aisle hissed, "How bold!" Vivian merely smiled wider. She positioned herself close enough to the path that Eleanor could not avoid seeing her. Close enough that the guests could compare them, Vivian in her scarlet triumph, Eleanor in her quiet ivory. Vivian turned to a cluster of women and spoke just loudly enough for the nearest rows to hear. "I give this marriage 6 months?" One of her friends laughed. "You are generous." Vivian's shoulders lifted in a lazy shrug. Julian Ravenshaw is not the sort of man who marries for love. Eleanor kept walking. She refused to glance away, refused to speed up, refused to show the smallest crack in her calm. But her chest tightened as the words followed her like thrown stones. 6 months. A mistake. A spectacle. When she drew closer to the altar, the garden fell into a hush, so complete she could hear the gravel crunch under her shoes. Eyes tracked her movement, then shifted toward the Duke. Someone murmured, half prayer, half sneer, "Let's see if he truly does this." Julian Ravenshaw watched Eleanor approach. From this distance she could read almost nothing from his face. His eyes were dark, steady, impossible to interpret. For one brief, disorienting moment, Eleanor wondered if he would turn his head, if he would acknowledge Lady Vivian, if he would hesitate, if the entire promise of this day would collapse at the final step. Then Eleanor reached him. She stopped. The clergyman opened his book. And Julian did something so simple that it broke the tension like glass. He extended his hand. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, you have come a rather long way to reach me." Eleanor's lips tightened, not in fear, but in something like resolve. "Not as far as people think, Your Grace," she answered. For the first time, a faint change touched his expression, just the smallest lift at one corner of his mouth. Nearly a smile, but restrained enough to remain private. He took her hand. No hesitation, no glance toward Lady Vivian, no apology to the crowd. Then, still holding Eleanor's hand, he turned to face the clergyman, as if the world behind him did not exist. A man in the second row whispered, stunned, "He truly did it." Another voice replied, dark with satisfaction, "God help him." The ceremony proceeded with the efficiency of tradition. Vows were spoken. The clergyman's words rose and fell in the measured cadence of Scripture, and Eleanor listened as though from a distance, her mind caught between the strange weight of the moment and the certainty that it was not what the world believed a wedding should be. Julian placed a ring on her finger. His hand did not tremble. His gaze did not soften. He did not look at her like a man in love, but he looked at her. That alone felt like something Eleanor had not received in years. When the clergyman declared them husband and wife, the garden released a collective breath. Some smiled as if relieved. Others smiled as if they had been denied a better show. Vivian's red dress remained at the edge of Eleanor's vision, like a wound that refused to close. Afterward, as guests began drifting toward the manor for the wedding breakfast, Julian guided Eleanor beneath an oak tree set slightly apart from the crowd. It was the closest he had come to privacy all day. He did not waste time on tenderness. "I trust you understand the nature of this marriage," he said. Eleanor held his gaze. "You require a duchess, and you require stability." Julian added his tone as even as stone. Eleanor's voice remained calm. "Stability is rare in this society, Your Grace." His eyes stayed on her a moment longer than necessary, as if assessing whether her composure was real or merely practiced. Then he said, "I hope Ravenshaw Manor will be a tolerable home for you. Not love, not devotion, but respect." Eleanor inclined her head. "That is more than tolerable. Thank you." Julian turned to rejoin the guests. The conversation finished as neatly as a signed contract. And Eleanor, standing alone for a moment beneath the oak, understood with a clarity that was almost merciful. This marriage had been chosen, but it had not been chosen for romance. 1 week later, Eleanor crossed the threshold of Ravenshaw Manor as its duchess. The manor rose from the land like something permanent, and unyielding stone walls, the color of old ash windows, tall and narrow, a grand entrance framed by pillars that had watched centuries of arrivals and departures. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of beeswax and polished wood. Eleanor's footsteps echoed in the great hall. It was not a welcoming echo. It was the echo of a place that did not easily belong to anyone. Agnes Pembroke, the housekeeper, who had served the Ravenshaw family for decades, greeted her near the staircase. She was upright and composed, hair pulled tight under her cap, eyes sharp with the authority of someone who knew every corner of the house better than its master did. "Welcome to Ravenshaw Manor, Your Grace," Agnes said, dipping into a precise curtsy. Eleanor offered a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Pembroke. I hope I will not disappoint anyone." Agnes's expression did not change, but there was something in her eyes, an acknowledgement perhaps, of Eleanor's effort to meet formality with grace. "This house has stood for more than 200 years, Agnes replied. "It has weathered wars, winters, and scandals. I believe it will make room for you as well." It was not warmth, but it was not cruelty. Eleanor accepted it as a beginning. In the following days, she was introduced to the staff in orderly succession. The butler, the cook, the footman, the maids, the steward, the secretary. Each bowed, each offered the correct words. Each seemed to measure her with a gaze that tried to determine what sort of mistress she would be. Julian was present for some introductions and absent for others. When he spoke to her, it was with politeness and brevity. He did not ignore her, but neither did he invite closeness. Their meals together were quiet affairs, spoken conversation limited to schedules, estate matters, and the weather. Eleanor did not press. She had learned long ago that pushing for affection only made its absence hurt more. But what she could not ignore was the shift that happened whenever a particular man entered any room. Lord Benedict Halgrave. The first time Eleanor saw him at Ravenshaw Manor, he arrived mid-afternoon announced by the butler with a formality that suggested the household considered him almost family. Lord Benedict Halgrave. Halgrave stepped into the drawing room with the ease of someone who belonged. He was well-dressed, impeccably groomed, handsome, in a controlled, conventional way. His smile was practiced, his eyes quick. Eleanor noticed something immediately. As Halgrave moved through the room, the staff became quieter. Footmen held their trays a fraction more carefully. Maids lowered their gazes. Even Agnes Pembroke's mouth tightened slightly, though she remained outwardly composed. Halgrave greeted Eleanor with a courteous bow. "Your Grace, I hope Ravenshaw Manor is not overwhelming." Eleanor returned his smile. "It is impressive, Lord Halgrave." Halgrave gave a light laugh. "Julian has always had a habit of keeping things larger than necessary." He said it like a joke, but there was an edge beneath it, an implication she could not fully name. After Halgrave left, Eleanor noticed her maid Lucy Carter, a young woman with clever eyes and a cautious manner, watching the door as if the air had changed. Eleanor asked quietly, "Lucy, does Lord Halgrave come often?" Lucy hesitated. "Very often, Your Grace." "He is close to His Grace." "Close," Eleanor repeated. Lucy lowered her voice. "Everyone says they have been friends for years, since before His Grace inherited." Eleanor nodded, but something in Lucy's tone made her add, "And do the staff like him?" Lucy's answer came out in a whisper. "They do not, Your Grace, not in the way one likes a guest." Eleanor did not press further. She simply filed the information away. The first unmistakable sign that something was wrong came during a hunting party. It was a bright autumn morning, cold enough that breath showed in pale clouds. Eleanor watched from an upstairs balcony as the riders gathered in the courtyard, men in boots and coach horses stamping impatiently. Julian mounted with practiced ease, the picture of aristocratic control. Halgrave rode beside him. Lucy stood behind Eleanor, hands folded neatly. "His Grace enjoys hunting," she said, as if offering a harmless detail. Eleanor's gaze stayed on the Duke. Does he enjoy it, or does he do it because it is expected? Lucy blinked, unsure how to answer. Before she could, the hunting party moved off toward the northern woods, hooves striking stone, voices fading. Hours passed. Eleanor tried to focus on domestic matters. She inspected the linen storage, reviewed menus, with the cook listened, as Agnes outlined the household's weekly schedule. But she could not shake the feeling of unease. Then late afternoon, the front doors burst open with unusual urgency. A footman rushed into the hall, face pale. An accident. The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She did not wait for explanation. She lifted her skirts and ran. Outside, the courtyard had become a scene of chaos. A riderless horse, its reins flapping, had returned, alone, nostrils flared, eyes rolling. Another horse followed, then another, and then the hunting party appeared in fragments, riders looking shaken. Julian was near the back, moving slower than the others. His coat was streaked with mud. His jaw was set. Halgrave rode ahead and dismounted quickly, speaking loudly, as if controlling the narrative through sheer volume. The Duke's saddle strap snapped, Halgrave announced. "A regrettable accident. Ravenshaw woods are treacherous." Eleanor moved toward Julian. He swung down from his horse with controlled stiffness. When his eyes met hers, he said, "Only I am fine." His voice was clipped, not angry, not frightened, simply refusing to make it larger than it needed to be. A servant carried the damaged saddle into the hall, holding it as if it were evidence. Eleanor followed, drawn by instinct. In the light of the great hall, she crouched slightly and examined the leather strap. It was not torn. It was cut. The cut was clean and deliberate. Halgrave stepped close, looking down at it with a thoughtful expression. "An unfortunate mishap," he said smoothly. Eleanor looked up at him. "Perhaps." Halgrave's smile flickered, then returned. "The forest does not always take kindly to writers, Your Grace." Behind her, Julian spoke, his tone calm. "We should not exaggerate." Eleanor stood still, staring at the strap. If Julian had been less skilled, if his balance had been off by the smallest margin, he would have died. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. The manor's grand hall, with its portraits of dead Ravenshaws gazing down in solemn judgment, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a cage. And in that cage, someone had just tried to remove the Duke. It looked like an accident, but something about it felt carefully planned. A hidden scheme is beginning to take shape inside Ravenshaw Manor, and Eleanor may be the only one who can uncover the truth before it's too late. Tell us what you think is really happening, and don't forget to subscribe before we move into the most intense part of the story. After the hunting incident, Ravenshaw Manor resumed its routines with a speed that felt unnatural. Breakfast was served at the usual hour. Letters arrived and were sorted. The staff moved through corridors with their usual precision. But Eleanor no longer believed in the surface calm. She began to watch the house the way she had once watched her own family's small drawing room during tense winters, quietly, carefully, taking note of what people said, and more importantly, what they refused to say. She spent long hours in the family library. The room suited her. It smelled of leather bindings and old paper, the air heavy with knowledge. Tall shelves rose to the ceiling. Cabinets held estate records and correspondence. A long oak table dominated the center, and Eleanor began to claim it as her own battlefield. She asked for the estate ledgers. Agnes Pembroke raised her eyebrows when the request was made, but she complied. Stacks of books were brought in. Thick, heavy volumes that recorded the lifeblood of Ravenshaw, rent payments, repairs wages, investments, withdrawals. Eleanor opened the first ledger and began turning pages. She read slowly at first, then faster. Her mind, trained by years of assisting her father with scholarly work, moved naturally through numbers and patterns. One afternoon, Lucy entered with a tray of tea. Lucy, Eleanor asked without looking up, "Does Ravenshaw Manor receive frequent visitors?" Lucy set the tray down carefully. "Only a few, Your Grace. Lord Halgrave comes most often. He is nearly family." Eleanor paused, pen hovering. Nearly. Lucy hesitated. "He and the Duke have been close for years." Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained on the ledger. "And the others?" Lucy shrugged. "Occasional solicitors, men from London. But Lord Halgrave is the most constant." Eleanor turned another page. A row of figures made her frown, not because they were large, but because they did not fit. The totals on one page failed to align with totals recorded elsewhere. The discrepancies were small, carefully disguised in the way dishonest people always disguise their theft, not with dramatic gaps, but with minor inconsistencies that would be overlooked by someone too busy or too trusting. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her pen. She kept reading. A few days later, she requested a meeting with Thomas Bell, the estate's financial manager. Bell arrived looking nervous, as if he suspected he was walking into a trap. He was a thin man, mid-40s, perhaps, with a habit of adjusting his spectacles whenever he felt pressure. "You asked to see the accounts." "Your Grace," he said. Eleanor slid a ledger toward him, open to a particular entry. "I would like to ask about this withdrawal." Bell's eyes dropped to the page, and Eleanor saw the moment his face shifted. A flicker of fear. He adjusted his spectacles. "Maintenance costs, Your Grace." Repairs to the north boundary wall. Eleanor's voice remained gentle. I reviewed maintenance costs from last year. Those repairs were half this amount. Bell swallowed. His hands tightened at his sides. He did not answer immediately. Silence stretched. Then, in a voice lowered as if even the walls might betray him, he said, "Some funds have been withdrawn, by order of His Grace." Eleanor met his gaze. By order of His Grace, or by His Grace's signature, Bell did not answer. He only stared at the ledger, as if it might swallow him whole. Eleanor's calm did not change. "Mr. Bell, I am not asking to accuse anyone. I am asking because my husband nearly died. That made him look up." "Your Grace." "Tell me the truth," Eleanor said quietly. Bell's jaw worked. "The signatures appear legitimate." "Appear," Eleanor repeated. Bell's face tightened. "I do not know how to say more without endangering myself." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Then say only what you can. Who has access to the accounts?" Bell hesitated, then whispered, "Lord Halgrave often assists. His Grace trusts him." Eleanor nodded as if that were simply a detail in a household report. "Thank you, Mr. Bell. That will be all for now." Bell left looking as if he had aged 5 years crossing the library threshold. After Bell's visit, Eleanor gathered several documents bearing Julian's signature. She laid them out across the table like pieces of a puzzle. One was a letter he had signed in her presence, neat, decisive handwriting, the R in Ravenshaw, sharp, the slope consistent. The second was a financial authorization, similar style, but the stroke at the end of his name held slightly longer. The third was a withdrawal order tied to one of the missing sums. At first glance, the signatures matched, but Eleanor's eyes were trained for small differences. The angle of the R shifted by a fraction. The pressure of the pen at the tail end of the name was inconsistent. A common observer would call it nothing. Eleanor did not. She leaned back and breathed out slowly. "Someone is signing his name," she murmured. Lucy, hovering by the door, asked softly, "Your Grace." Eleanor looked up. "Nothing, Lucy. Just stay attentive." Lucy nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. That evening, Lucy knocked on Eleanor's door. When she entered, she shut it with unusual care. "I think you should know something," Lucy whispered. Eleanor set her book aside. "Tell me." "Last night, Lucy said I saw Lord Halgrave in the back courtyard. He met with a stranger." Eleanor sat up straighter. "Did you hear what they said?" Lucy shook her head. "Not clearly, but they exchanged an envelope." Eleanor rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the garden lay black and quiet. Only one light burned brightly, Julian's office still lit, as always. Eleanor's voice was steady. "If you see them again, Lucy, you will tell me immediately." Lucy nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." 2 nights later, Lucy appeared again, breathless cheeks flushed from running. "They're there," she whispered. "Now." Eleanor pulled on a cloak and followed her down a side corridor away from the main stairs. They moved with careful silence, the sort of silence servants learned, and ladies rarely needed except when survival demanded it. From a shadowed landing that overlooked the rear steps, Eleanor could hear voices. Halgrave's voice was smooth, carrying easily in the night air. "After Ravenshaw disappears," he said, "everything will return to its rightful place." A lower voice answered, and the Duchess Halgrave gave a soft laugh. A small mistake in a larger plan. Eleanor froze. She could not see the stranger's face. The darkness hid him. But Halgrave's meaning was clear enough to make her blood run cold. Ravenshaw disappears. A mistake. Her. Eleanor stepped back into the shadow heart, beating with controlled force. Lucy's eyes were wide beside her. Eleanor whispered, "We go." They retreated up the corridor, their steps careful and quiet. Back in her room, Eleanor removed her cloak and stood very still, as if the act of moving might allow fear to spill out. But she would not let it. She had spent her life being overlooked. It had taught her how to watch without being seen. Now she would use that skill for something that mattered. The next morning, Eleanor went directly to Julian's office. Julian looked up from his letters as she entered. "There is something wrong," Eleanor said at once. "I believe Lord Halgrave is plotting against you." Julian's brows drew together. Halgrave. Eleanor explained what she had observed: the missing funds, the signature discrepancies, the midnight meetings, the phrase she had heard in the garden. Julian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood and moved toward the window, the exact same posture he had held when he first confronted the rumors of his own near death, contained controlled, refusing to let emotion rise. Finally, he said, "Halgrave saved my life in the war." Eleanor replied calmly, "Then, perhaps, he believes you owe him everything." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. "If he wished me harm, he has had opportunity for years." "Then perhaps he is waiting for the perfect moment," Eleanor said. Julian turned back to her. "You have lived here less than a month." Eleanor's gaze did not waver. Sometimes an outsider sees what an insider refuses to see. Julian held her eyes for a moment, then looked away. "I will consider what you have said," he said, as if granting the possibility without granting belief. Eleanor did not argue further. She had learned that forcing someone to accept the truth before they were ready only made them more defensive. She left his office feeling no relief, only urgency. A few days later, Lucy brought another piece of the puzzle. She approached Eleanor in the corridor, her voice barely audible. "Your Grace, I saw Lord Halgrave last night in the greenhouse," Eleanor asked. With the stranger again. Lucy shook her head, then hesitated, as if the name itself might cause trouble. "No," she whispered, "with Lady Vivian." Ashcroft. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something inside her settled into place. The alliance was real. It was not merely Halgrave acting alone. It was Halgrave acting with someone who hated this marriage enough to destroy it. That night, Eleanor laid her papers out once more and let her mind assemble the pattern: the hunting accident, the missing funds, the forged signatures, the secret meetings, Vivian's presence and contempt, Halgrave's phrase "after Ravenshaw disappears." It was not simply theft, it was takeover. And the plan was elegant in its cruelty. If Halgrave could engineer enough financial irregularity tied to Julian's name, Parliament, or any authority with the power to intervene, could claim the Duke was unfit to manage his estates. They could remove control from him for the protection of the property. And who would they appoint as interim manager? Not Eleanor. Not a woman with no powerful family. Someone close to Julian. Someone trusted. Someone who already had access. Lord Benedict Halgrave. Eleanor's fingers curled into a fist on the table. She needed to tell Julian everything, the full shape of the trap. But before she could, the trap closed around her instead. The coldness that settled over Ravenshaw Manor after the documents were found did not announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived the way winter arrived, in old houses quietly slipping beneath the cracks, changing the air until even familiar rooms felt inhospitable. Eleanor felt it in the pauses that followed her footsteps, in the way a maid's eyes dropped too quickly when she entered a corridor, in the stiffness of the butler's shoulders when he offered her the morning tray. And most of all, she felt it in Julian Ravenshaw. He did not accuse her openly. That would have been too crude for a man like him. He did not shout because shouting would have given emotion to something he wanted to handle as an inconvenient fact. Instead, he summoned her to his office. The room was a long rectangle of dark wood and darker silence. Papers were spread across the oak desk like a crime laid out for judgment. Outside the tall window, the morning was gray and cold, as if the sky had been drained of color. Julian stood with his back to the light near the window, hands clasped behind him. He looked carved rather than living. Eleanor remained on the other side of the desk, fingertips resting lightly on the back of a chair. She did not sit. Sitting felt like surrender. Julian spoke slowly, each word measured. These documents were found in your rooms. Eleanor's eyes dropped to the papers. At the bottom of each page was Julian's signature, his name reduced to ink used as a weapon. Julian continued, as if reading from a report. The funds referenced here were transferred from the Ravenshaw accounts. Eleanor lifted her gaze. And you believe I did it? For a moment he did not answer. That silence was worse than anger. It said he could not dismiss the possibility, no matter how absurd it was. Eleanor's voice remained calm, almost mild. If I intended to steal from you, I would not leave the evidence in my own rooms. Julian's eyes narrowed. It was the first visible crack in his composure. Her logic was simple, and that made it dangerous. A simple truth could force him to think, and thinking could pull him away from the narrative someone else had prepared. He said, "You understand what this looks like?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "It looks like someone wants it to look like this." The words hung between them. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. He expected hysteria or outrage. He had grown up around women trained to perform emotion as a form of power tears that demanded sympathy, fury, that demanded attention. Eleanor offered none of that. She only looked at him steadily like a person who had already endured worse than social ruin. Julian said, "Until I determine what has happened, you will remain here." Eleanor inclined her head. "I have no intention of leaving." "And you will not involve the staff," he added. "Gossip spreads." Eleanor's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Gossip has already spread, Your Grace." At the title, Julian's gaze flickered. He had been Julian in the privacy of their marriage only on paper. In practice, he remained the Duke, and she remained the woman he had chosen for reasons he had never fully explained. He watched her a moment longer, as if waiting for her to plead or insist on her innocence in a more desperate tone. Eleanor did not. She simply said softly but clearly, "If I wanted to betray you, I would not still be here." Julian stared at her. The sentence was not dramatic. That was what made it cutting. It forced him to picture an alternative Eleanor, one who fled the moment scandal appeared, one who took what she could and disappeared into the countryside. That was what the story in the papers would have people believe. But the woman standing in his office, pale in the gray light, did not look like someone planning an escape. She looked like someone deciding to stand her ground. Julian said nothing more. He turned back to the desk as if ending the conversation by refusing to continue it. Eleanor left without looking back. She did not know as she walked down the corridor whether she had moved Julian at all. She only knew that she had placed a question in his mind, and questions had a way of eating through certainty. Julian Ravenshaw remained alone in his office long after Eleanor's footsteps faded. He picked up one of the documents and held it closer to the window light. The signature looked like his. That was the point. The shape of the letters, the rhythm of the strokes, whoever had done it had studied him. But something was wrong. The final stroke of his name pressed too hard, as though the hand that wrote it had been trying to prove confidence it did not possess. Julian opened his desk drawer and pulled out a letter he had signed the previous day. A simple note to a solicitor in London. He placed the two signatures side by side. The difference was slight, but it existed, and Julian had built his life on noticing slight differences, on spotting weakness in negotiations, hesitation in enemies, the faint shift in tone that signaled betrayal. His throat tightened. "Someone has learned to write my name," he murmured to the empty room. He remembered Eleanor's voice. Who benefits? If Duke Ravenshaw is accused of fraud, he did not want the answer. But he feared he already knew where it would lead. That afternoon, Julian summoned Thomas Bell. Bell entered with the same strained expression he wore whenever anyone of higher rank asked him a question. The man had the demeanor of someone who had spent years living around power without ever being allowed to touch it. Julian placed a document in front of him. "Do you recognize this signature?" Bell adjusted his spectacles and looked down. His lips parted. "It is yours, Your Grace." Julian's voice cut like ice. "No, it is not. It is forged." Bell's face lost what little color it had. Julian leaned forward slightly, not raising his voice, but increasing the pressure in a way Bell could feel. "Who has access to the financial records?" Bell swallowed. His gaze darted once toward the door, as if expecting someone to appear there. Then he stammered, "Lord Halgrave sometimes assists me. He says His Grace wants him involved. He reviews matters when His Grace is occupied." Julian did not react outwardly, but something inside him went very still. Halgrave. It was a name Julian had trusted for years. A name tied to the battlefield, to nights of blood and smoke, to a hand pulling him from danger. And yet, Julian dismissed Bell with a nod that was almost too courteous. When the door closed, Julian sat back and stared at the table, as if the wood might offer an explanation. He did not want to believe Eleanor. He did not want to believe his own eyes. But he wanted even less to be a fool. That evening, Julian opened the ledgers himself. He had always left such work to men like Bell, not out of laziness, but out of the confidence that he could delegate without fear. Delegation was how estates survived. No man, not even a duke, could oversee everything alone. But now he read line by line. He compared dates. He traced withdrawals. He examined the patterns Eleanor had noticed before him. And slowly, sickeningly, the shape of it emerged. Every questionable transfer coincided with one thing: Halgrave's presence at the manor. Julian sat in the dim light of his office, fingers pressing into his brow. He remembered the hunting incident, the snap strap, the moment his horse had lurched and the world had tilted, the ground rushing up too fast. Halgrave had been the first to speak, the first to label it a mishap, a regrettable accident. Julian's stomach turned. "God," he whispered. "God." He wanted to dismiss the thought as paranoia, but he could not. Not when the evidence lay on his desk like bones. It was late when Julian went to the library. If there was one place in Ravenshaw Manor where Eleanor seemed to belong, it was there among old books and quiet truths. He found her seated at the long oak table, papers spread around her in careful order. A lamp cast warm light over her hair, softening the lines of fatigue at her face. She looked up as he entered. Julian closed the door behind him. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply watched her, as if trying to understand how this woman, so unremarkable to London, had become the only person in the manor who seemed awake. Then he said quietly, "Perhaps I have misjudged someone." Eleanor set her pen down. "What did you discover?" Julian walked to the table and placed a document before her. "Halgrave is the only one who could have accessed all of this." Eleanor's gaze flicked over the page. She did not look surprised. "I know," she said. Julian frowned. "You know," Eleanor nodded once. "I only lacked proof. And proof is the only language men like him respect." Julian stared at her. It was not arrogance in her tone. It was clarity. He said, "Why did you not tell me all of this sooner?" Eleanor's mouth tightened in something like restrained pain. "I tried," she answered. "You did not want to hear it." Julian looked away, the smallest admission of guilt. Then he asked, "What do you believe his aim is?" Eleanor drew a breath and began to lay out her reasoning, not with drama, but with the steady precision of someone who had been forced to rely on logic her entire life. She pointed to one ledger. "The withdrawals are not random. They are staged." She pointed to another page. "The forged signatures appear only on the largest transfers, enough to be noticed, but disguised well enough to appear like oversight." Julian asked, "And what happens when enough is noticed?" Eleanor met his gaze. "They bring you to London," she said. "They place you before men who pretend they care about the integrity of the estate. They say you are unfit. They say you cannot be trusted with your own fortune." Julian's mouth tightened, and then Eleanor's finger tapped softly against the paper. "Then they appoint someone temporary to manage Ravenshaw until the matter's resolved." Julian's voice was cold now. "Halgrave." Eleanor nodded. "Halgrave." Julian exhaled slowly. "And my wife becomes the convenient culprit." Eleanor's eyes did not flinch. "Yes?" Julian's hand tightened into a fist on the table's edge. For the first time since Eleanor had married him, she saw real anger break through his careful restraint. Not the anger of a man insulted in public, but of a man who realized his closest ally had been sharpening a knife behind his back. He said, rougher than before, "He has been at my table. He has smiled at me. He has," Eleanor interrupted gently, "he has played his part well." Julian looked at her sharply. "Why are you so calm?" he asked. Eleanor's voice softened. "Because I have spent my whole life watching people smile while they meant harm." The truth of that landed heavier than accusation. Julian's gaze shifted over her face as if he were seeing it differently now, not as plain, not as forgettable, but as something shaped by endurance. He swallowed once. Then he said, "We need proof that cannot be dismissed." Eleanor nodded. "We do." Julian glanced at the papers. "If Halgrave suspects I am onto him, he will vanish. Then we do not allow him to suspect," Eleanor replied. Julian's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. How Eleanor leaned forward, voice low. "We give him what he wants," she said. "Confidence." Julian's brows lifted slightly. "You have a plan." "We arrange a meeting," Eleanor said. "A formal review of the finances." Julian gave a dry, humorless sound. "A trial." "Not officially," Eleanor corrected, "but it will feel like one." Julian stared at her, then nodded slowly. "And we invite the right people," he said. Eleanor's eyes flicked up, approving. A solicitor from London, a representative from the bank, a few neighboring gentlemen with reputation for propriety. Julian's voice sharpened with grim understanding. "And Halgrave will think I am preparing to blame you." Eleanor's expression remained composed. "Yes, Julian studied her for a long moment. "Are you prepared for that?" he asked quietly. "For him to believe I have turned against you, for the household to believe it as well." Eleanor did not hesitate. "They already believe it," she said. "Let them." Julian's eyes held hers. Something shifted there, something like respect, and something like shame. He said, "You should not have had to stand alone." Eleanor's answer was calm. "Perhaps not, but I am accustomed to it." Julian looked away again, as if the admission pained him. Then he said, "We do this carefully." Eleanor nodded. "We do." The meeting was arranged with discreet urgency. Letters were sent. Appointments were made. Julian allowed the household to hear hints of concern enough to travel, because in houses like Ravenshaw, servants were the true messengers, and the corridors carried news faster than carriages. Within 2 days, Halgrave arrived at the manor as if he owned it. He stepped into the drawing room with his usual ease hair, immaculate coat, perfectly cut expression warm. "Julian," he said, voice smooth as polished brass. "I heard there is trouble with the family finances." Julian remained standing near the fireplace, hands behind his back, an echo of his posture in the office, but this time weaponized. "Only misunderstandings," Julian replied coolly. Halgrave smiled. "Misunderstandings can be expensive." His gaze slid to Eleanor, who sat quietly near the window, hands folded in her lap. "Your Grace," Halgrave said, with exaggerated politeness, "I hope this situation has not been too distressing." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "It is rarely the situation itself that distresses me," she said. "It is the person who creates it." Halgrave's smile did not falter, but his eyes sharpened. "An interesting perspective." Julian said, "We will review the accounts tomorrow." Halgrave's brows lifted slightly. So soon, Julian's voice was bland. "I prefer matters resolved promptly." Halgrave nodded, as if approving. "Of course, if there is anything I can do to assist, I am certain you will," Julian interrupted gently. Halgrave's smile deepened, missing the subtle warning beneath Julian's tone. "Yes," he said, "I always do." The following afternoon, the West Hall was set with a long table, papers neatly arranged. The atmosphere resembled a court more than a household meeting. The Ravenshaw solicitor, a man with silver hair and a patient expression, sat with quill and ink ready. A bank representative, a stern gentleman in plain black, looked as if he had not enjoyed himself since childhood. 2 neighboring landowners attended, invited under the guise of moral oversight, men who prized their reputations and loved appearing righteous. Halgrave took his seat as if it were a throne. Eleanor was the last to enter. She carried a thick ledger against her chest, its worn leather binding held with care. Halgrave's gaze narrowed as she approached the table. "What is that?" he asked. Eleanor set it down with a quiet, decisive thud. "The original financial ledger of Thomas Bell," she said. Halgrave gave a light laugh. "We have already reviewed the ledgers." Eleanor opened it to the first page, her movements deliberate. "Not this one," she said. The solicitor leaned forward, interest sharpening. The bank representative adjusted his spectacles. Julian remained silent, watching Halgrave rather than the book. Halgrave's smile faltered by half a breath, then returned. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Why was this ledger not produced sooner?" Eleanor looked at him. "Because it was hidden." One of the neighboring gentlemen frowned. Hidden by whom? Eleanor's voice remained calm. "I believe that is what we are about to discover." Halgrave's expression hardened slightly. "Accusations require evidence, Your Grace." Eleanor nodded once, agreed. She turned the ledger toward the bank representative and pointed to a set of entries. "These are the original figures recorded before any alterations were made," she said. She flipped to another page. "And these are the transfers that correspond with the withdrawals in the forged documents." The bank representative frowned. "These accounts do not match the ones in the submitted paperwork." "Because the submitted paperwork was altered," Eleanor replied. Halgrave leaned back. "And you claim this ledger is authentic," Eleanor said. "Thomas Bell will confirm it." At Eleanor's glance, Thomas Bell, standing near the door, pale and trembling, was ushered forward. Bell swallowed hard. "That is my original ledger," he said. "It was removed from my office without my permission. I found it later in a locked cabinet behind the old map room. Duchess Ravenshaw asked me to check whether it had been changed. It has not." Murmurs rippled around the table. Halgrave's eyes flashed. Julian spoke for the first time, voice cool. "Proceed." Eleanor turned to the pages again. "These transfers were made to a secondary account," she said, "one not disclosed in the initial records." The bank representative's expression tightened. "And the account holder?" Eleanor lifted her gaze to Halgrave. "Benedict." "Halgrave," she said. Silence fell like a curtain. Even the fireplace seemed to pause. Halgrave's mouth opened, then closed, as if his mind had to catch up with the sudden collapse of his control. "That is absurd," he snapped. "A fabrication." Eleanor's voice was soft. "Is it?" The solicitor leaned forward, eyes sharp. "The bank can verify the account holder." The bank representative nodded slowly. "We can." Halgrave's face darkened. "This is a trap." Julian's voice remained even. "Then explain the money." Halgrave's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "You have no proof that I forged anything," he said, voice rising slightly. "Numbers can be arranged. Books can be altered." Eleanor said, "Yes, they can." Halgrave smiled coldly. "So you understand the game, Your Grace?" "That is admirable for someone of your background." The insult was precise. Eleanor did not react. Instead, she said, "There is something else." Halgrave's eyes narrowed. "Of course there is." Eleanor looked to the solicitor. "May we have the meeting record?" The solicitor slid the blank parchment toward her. Eleanor dipped the quill in ink, then set it down in front of Halgrave. "Sign the record of this meeting," she said politely, "as a witness." Halgrave hesitated just a fraction, then smiled. "You want my signature?" Eleanor's tone was mild. "It is customary." Halgrave took the quill and signed with flourish, as though announcing his superiority with each stroke. He pushed the paper back across the table. "There," he said. "Now are we finished with these theatrics?" Eleanor lifted the page, turned it, and placed it beside one of the forged documents. Julian leaned forward. For the first time in the meeting, his expression changed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor said quietly, "The forged signatures were written by the same hand." Halgrave scoffed. "And you intend to prove that?" How Eleanor's gaze lifted. "You just did," she said. Halgrave froze. Eleanor tapped the paper he had just signed. "You signed the meeting record." Julian placed Halgrave's fresh signature beside the forged ones. The similarity was unmistakable. The angle, the pressure, the particular way the final stroke pressed too hard. A neighboring gentleman whispered, horrified, "Good God!" Halgrave's face twisted, his composure finally cracking. This is he slammed his hand on the table. "This is a conspiracy against me." Julian stood slowly. "Against you," Julian said softly. "Or against me?" Halgrave's eyes burned. "You would choose her over me after everything." Julian's voice turned lethal. "I am choosing evidence." Halgrave's gaze flicked towards the door. Then he barked Vivian. The doors opened. Lady Vivian Ashcroft stepped into the hall as if she had been waiting nearby, her posture stiff with alarm. But before she could speak, Julian placed a bundle of letters on the table. "Your correspondence," Julian said. Vivian's face drained of color. Halgrave's voice shook. No, Julian lifted one letter. "This is your handwriting," he said to Vivian, "and this is your recommendation." Vivian's lips parted. Julian Eleanor's voice cut in, calm and devastating. "You thought no one noticed your meetings in the greenhouse." Vivian stumbled backward. "I noticed," Eleanor said simply. "Because I have spent my life being invisible. No one watches an invisible woman." Halgrave's chest heaved. He looked around the table, the solicitor, the bank representative, the neighboring gentleman, all of them staring at him as if seeing a stranger for the first time. He realized in that single dreadful second that he was no longer the charming companion of a duke. He was a criminal in a room full of witnesses. Halgrave snarled, "You cannot prove I meant to harm anyone." Julian's eyes were ice. "You cut my saddle strap." Halgrave went still. Silence again. The absence of denial was louder than confession. Julian turned his head slightly. "Guards," he said. Two men stepped into the hall. Halgrave's breath hitched. For the first time in years, perhaps his confidence failed him entirely. He looked at Julian, then at Eleanor. His voice dropped venomous. "You think you have won?" Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I think the truth," as she replied. By morning, Ravenshaw Manor had become something it had not been in generations, a place where power had to answer for itself. The West Hall was filled again, not with neighbors this time, but with officials. A government man from London arrived in a plain carriage, accompanied by a clerk and two constables. The Ravenshaw solicitors stood ready. The bank representative returned with sealed documents. Halgrave was kept under watch, his hands unbound, but his freedom already gone. When asked to sign the first official statement, he attempted one last time to salvage control. "Surely all of this can be resolved quietly," Julian Halgrave said, voice smooth with desperate familiarity. "We are friends. We can." Julian stepped forward, expression hard. "No," he said. "You attempted to steal my estate, my reputation, and perhaps my life. This will not be resolved quietly." Halgrave's eyes flicked to Eleanor, hatred sharp enough to cut. "It is remarkable," he said. "A girl London laughed at thinks she can ruin me." Eleanor's answer was calm. "I am not ruining you, Lord Halgrave. You began ruining yourself long before I arrived at Ravenshaw." Thomas Bell was called to testify again. He shook as he spoke, but he spoke clearly, describing the ledger, the altered figures, the pressure Halgrave had applied, the times he had been ordered to hand over records outside normal procedure. The older solicitor held the documents for a long time, then said with grave certainty, "These figures are sufficient to pursue charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to seize control of the estate." Only then did Halgrave's expression truly change. The mask of charm slipped entirely. "This is exaggerated," Halgrave insisted. "I sought only to protect Ravenshaw from poor decisions." Julian's voice was quiet, sharper than a blade. "Is that why you cut my saddle strap?" Halgrave did not answer. That silence was the final nail. The official nodded to the constables. Halgrave's shoulders stiffened as they approached. His eyes met Julian's for a fraction of a second, pure fury, and something else beneath it, something like fear. Then they took him. The news hit London like fire in a dry season. It passed faster than any formal proclamation carried by servants, carriage drivers, shopkeepers, and bored women hungry for scandal. By the next morning, the salons of Mayfair buzzed with it. In Belgravia, teacups paused halfway to lips as women leaned in. Lord Halgrave was arrested at Ravenshaw. Someone whispered, eyes bright. Another replied, I heard there were letters and a ledger. At St. James's, in a gentleman's club heavy with cigar smoke, a man folded his newspaper and said, half incredulous, and do you know where it all began? His friend looked up. Where? The Duchess? The first man replied, Duchess, Eleanor Ravenshaw. The friend frowned confusion, giving way to recognition. You mean the girl they called the mistake bride. A small awkward smile answered him. Yes, the man said. That very girl. London could accept many shocking truths, but this one unsettled them in a way Halgrave's arrest never could. A duke being betrayed by his friend was scandalous. A quiet, plain duchess outthinking everyone was humiliating, because it meant the city's judgment, so confidently delivered, had been wrong from the beginning. In drawing rooms, the story took shape in fragments. Not the full truth. London rarely told full truths, but enough. The Duchess noticed discrepancies in the accounts. She recognized forged handwriting. She saw Halgrave meeting someone at night. She trapped him into signing a paper so they could match the signature. At Lady Beatrice Langley's table, a woman shook her head. I never thought she could do anything beyond curtsy properly. Lady Beatrice lifted her cup with measured grace, her tone cooler than usual. Perhaps that is because we have been too busy staring at gowns and family names to remember that intelligence can be a kind of power. The sentence, so simple, was repeated elsewhere, and with each repetition, Eleanor's name changed shape. From mistake to mystery, from unworthy to remarkable. Not because London suddenly grew kind, but because London could not tolerate being wrong without rewriting the story so it looked intentional. If Eleanor rose in the city's reluctant respect, Vivian fell in silence. The letters between Vivian and the Halgrave were not enough to drag her into criminal conviction in the same way. Influence could soften legal consequences for women like Vivian, but influence could not soften reputation once the salon doors began to close. The cruelest line, copied and repeated with delighted disgust, came from Vivian herself. A man like Julian Ravenshaw deserves to be returned to his rightful place before a feminine mistake ruins everything. The words were recited with contempt by the same mouths that once smiled at her red gown. Within days, a curtained carriage left London before dawn. A servant at the gate of her townhouse bowed without looking up as her luggage was loaded. The housekeeper murmured to a maid, Lady Vivian is going to France. There was no public farewell, no sympathetic friends waving handkerchiefs, only the quiet vanishing of a woman who had believed her claim on Ravenshaw was permanent. Back at Ravenshaw Manor, life resumed, but differently. The staff moved with less tension, as if a pressure in the walls had eased. Tea was served at the usual hour again. Footsteps in corridors no longer quickened when Halgrave's name was spoken. Doors no longer felt like secrets waiting to snap shut. One morning Eleanor walked past the greenhouse and saw Agnes Pembroke directing gardeners as they arranged early spring pots, white blossoms and greenery, meant to soften the stone terrace. Agnes turned her voice steadier than Eleanor had ever heard it. Your Grace, would you like more white flowers on the east steps? Eleanor paused, glancing toward the terrace. The light there was gentle in the morning, pale and soft. Yes, Eleanor said. I think the morning light needs something calmer. Agnes nodded once the smallest sign of approval. A choice suited to Ravenshaw, she said. It was a simple sentence, but Eleanor heard the meaning beneath it. This house, which had watched centuries of women come and go, was beginning to accept her not as a visitor, not as a temporary ornament, but as its mistress. That afternoon, Julian rode along the edge of the northern woods and returned without incident. No one watched the saddle straps with fearful eyes. No one checked the leather for hidden cuts. The piece felt fragile, but it was real enough to breathe. That evening, Eleanor returned to the library. She sat at the oak table where her notes had once been scattered in frantic piles. Now the table was clean. A single book lay open before her, but she was not truly reading. The fire crackled softly, the sound intimate in the hush. When the door opened, Julian entered. He did not speak immediately. He moved to the fireplace, stood with his hands clasped behind him, staring into the flames as if looking for words in the shifting light. Eleanor waited. Julian finally turned. London thought I married wrongly, he said, voice low and slow. Eleanor lifted her eyes to him. There was no mockery in his tone, only honesty, rare, unguarded. Yes, she replied softly, and London enjoys being certain it is correct. Julian studied her as if for the first time he was not seeing a duchess, not seeing the woman the city had dismissed, but seeing Eleanor herself. His gaze held no suspicion now, only something heavier. Yet you remained, he said quietly. Eleanor's hands rested on the table. Fingers relaxed. I did. Julian's throat moved as he swallowed. You could have left. I could have, Eleanor agreed. But leaving would have meant they were right. Julian stepped closer, the firelight softening the harsh planes of his face. I believed them, he admitted, barely above a whisper. For a moment, Eleanor's expression did not change. But something in her eyes, something tender and tired, flickered. I know, she said. Julian's mouth tightened. He looked at her hands on the table, then back to her face. I have been thanked for many things, he said. For land, for money, for influence. I have never been thanked for being a decent man. Eleanor tilted her head slightly unsure. Julian's voice grew quieter, more careful. But I think... He paused as if the next words were unfamiliar. I think I have married the only person who could have saved me. Eleanor did not answer at once. For weeks she had prepared herself to be doubted, to be discarded, to become a cautionary tale. She had never prepared for tenderness from Julian Ravenshaw, a man who lived behind walls built long before she arrived. She asked in a voice gentle enough not to break the moment, "Are you thanking me or correcting a mistake?" Julian's eyes held hers. "Perhaps both," he said. Eleanor looked down at her hand on the table, a small movement that betrayed the emotion she refused to dramatize. "I do not need London to change its opinion of me," she said quietly. "I have lived with London's opinions my entire life." Julian's mouth curved, not a full smile, but the beginning of one. "I know," he said, "and perhaps that is why they must change." Eleanor's lips softened into the faintest smile, small, restrained, but real. The first smile in days that held no exhaustion behind it. Julian stepped closer until he stood beside her chair. He did not command. He did not keep the stiff distance he had kept since their wedding. He simply held out his hand. In the early weeks of their marriage, he had taken her hand in public because it was required, because the role of husband demanded it. That touch had always been careful, impersonal, like a duty fulfilled. Now there was no audience, no obligation, only choice. Eleanor placed her hand in his. Julian's fingers closed around hers with a gentle pressure that felt almost unfamiliar, like something he had never allowed himself to do. He said softly, "I left you alone for too long." Eleanor's voice was quiet. "I am still here." Julian's gaze lowered to their joined hands, then lifted back to her face. "I know," he said. It was not a grand confession of love. It was not a promise of passion. But it was something truer, recognition, trust, and the slow turning of a man who had always believed vulnerability was weakness. Eleanor did not pull her hand away. She let him hold it. And in that small private gesture, she felt the strange, steady warmth of being chosen not by society, not by rumor, not by the loud and beautiful world that had laughed at her, but by the one person whose choice mattered. In the months that followed, London continued to speak of the Ravenshaw marriage because London always spoke. But the story changed shape. It was no longer a cruel joke about a duke who had made an embarrassing mistake. It became a tale told with a different flavor, half awe, half discomfort, because it reminded the city that its judgments were not as flawless as it liked to believe. They spoke of a woman who had been dismissed as forgettable and proved herself unforgettable. They spoke of a duke betrayed by his closest friend and saved by the wife he had never expected to need. They spoke of a marriage that began as a practical arrangement and survived a storm strong enough to destroy estates and reputations. And at Ravenshaw Manor, beneath ancient oaks and in corridors that had once felt like cages, a new kind of quiet, settled one built not from fear, but from stability earned. Eleanor did not need London's approval, but as she stood in the library on a winter evening, Julian's hand resting lightly over hers, she understood something she had not dared to hope for when she first stepped onto that gravel path in her simple ivory dress. The world could laugh all it wanted. The truth had already changed everything. And that was the moment London finally realized the mistake bride had been the only one brave enough to see the truth all along. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who changes everything. Thank you for listening to this story with us. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Until our next story, take care and keep listening.